Okay, so now we're looking at effects. That's up here, and in order to apply for anything, you do have to have something selected. I'll go ahead and make a couple copies of this just so I can play. Alright, so you do have to have, of course, have the whole thing selected. For this, I have many pieces, so I'm going to go ahead and group it as one thing so that I don't just apply the effect to one tiny little piece that I can't really notice. So for this one, again, use the normal selection tool, select it, go up to effect. These are the last ones I did, so it has that up here. If you're not unsure how you have it set, occasionally there are some raster effects, which means it's thinking of it in pixel terms. It's too complicated for it to do it as a vector. It's just too weird of a thing. So you might need to do it as a vector with raster effects. So that one I would just always leave at 300. I would never make it smaller than that, but you could make it bigger with the other. But that's just if you weren't paying attention, you weren't quite sure. The normal default is 300. Alright, so under the effects, there are a bunch of them that I'm not going to walk through, but you can if you want to. What I would recommend, just to try some basic ones, is you can see here the Pathfinder is all here, but remember that it's also under the window. If you do the Pathfinder down here, that's better, I think, in my opinion, rather than the text. You can rasterize things, by the way, if you for some reason need it to act like a photograph. Or be pixel based, you can make it rasterized. Again, if you do that, make sure you do it at a higher resolution. And this again is going to be switched over to a photograph, basically a pixel by pixel photograph. We don't necessarily want to do that though. Now, Stylize is one that I use pretty heavily. Some of these ones under here, generally it's going to be these basic ones like a drop shadow, outer glow, some things like that. So I'm not going to do a lot of them. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. This I wish looked as easy as Photoshop's does for the effects, but it doesn't. Unfortunately, it's not quite as nice. But you can still do most of the things it does. It's just a little bit less obvious, I guess, in some ways. So I would hit the preview button so you can see what you're doing. Remember that black does not have to be your drop shadow color. It could be something else. You can change the blur. You can either decrease it, make it super flat, or you can of course increase it and make it more fuzzy, more and more fuzzy. The X and Y axis is just, where does that lie? In Photoshop, it talks about it in terms of angle. So this is a little bit different, but again, the outcome is essentially the same. And then you can of course change the opacity if it's too much or too little. And the screen mode that it uses is multiply. Depending on what color backgrounds you have, you could possibly change it, but the default is always going to be multiply. So that's just one of them. And then you can go through the Photoshop effects one. Again, be careful, they're going to look kind of cheesy. Most of the time you'd probably use this more on a photograph than a graphic, but you could try. The Gaussian Blur, again, I'm not sure why you would want to blur something necessarily, but you could if you want to. Up to you. I just switched this back on, and what I want to show you is where to find this information once you've actually done it to it. If you want to change it, so if, let's say, okay, I added some things, how do I take it off if you change your mind? It's a little bit similar to that stuff in Photoshop, but here you have to go to Appearance. And under Appearance, if then it'll show you what you're doing. So for this one in particular, it's been rasterized, which I don't need that anymore, so I can get rid of that one. Whoops, didn't mean to do all of them. So you can turn the eye off and on. Sometimes it'll make a difference, sometimes it won't. In this case, I'm going to delete it because I don't actually want that anymore. For this one, I can turn the drop shadow on and off. I can turn the Gaussian blur on and off. And finally, you can change the opacity. The opacity is set to default on here. You can change it up here if you wish to make it a different level. And the other thing that you can change here is, again, the setting. So the blending mode can be changed here. So you can, all the stuff that you could do in Photoshop for blending modes, you can do here as well. So this is an area for sure that you will use, but just remember that the things are under appearance, but you have to actually select it to see them, because every single piece that you have in Illustrator could actually have a different appearance, and so that you just have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, it just is showing you some basic information about the file, which you probably don't need.